Before we begin, take a slow breath. If you enjoyed gentle journeys through history stories told not to rush you, but to let you drift through the past, please tap like, share this episode with someone who loves calm history, and subscribe so you can travel with us again. Now close your eyes, or let them rest on the screen, and imagine the sound of evening wind over dry grass. Somewhere, far across the world, that same wind moves over a lonely hill called Hisarlik. The hill stands above the northwestern coast of modern Turkey, a mound of pale stone and soil, where sea air mixes with the scent of earth. To the casual traveler, it looks unremarkable. Another ridge above the plains that lead to the Dardanelles. Yet beneath that hill lie more than 4,000 years of human life. 9, maybe 10, layers of settlement built one over another, each raised by people who believed their city would last forever. They called it Wilusa, Truisa, Ilios, and eventually Troy. Picture the landscape around 3000 BCE. The sea was closer then, pressing against a fertile plain crossed by the Scamander River. Fishermen pulled in silver-scaled catch at dawn. Farmers drove wooden plows through damp soil. Traders guided donkey caravans toward the narrow strait that linked the Aegean to the Black Sea. Even then, Troy's location was destiny. Whoever held this ground controlled the meeting of two continents. They built houses of sun-baked mud brick, then stronger ones of limestone. They ringed them with low walls to keep out flood and thief. By 2500 BCE, the settlement had swollen into a small fortress with towers, gates, and storage rooms filled with jars of grain and oil. The people of Troy learned to balance fear and ambition. Beyond the horizon, new powers were stirring. Mycenae in the west, the Hittite kings in the east. To survive between them required more than courage. It demanded diplomacy. Archaeologists call these layers Troy the First through the Nine. Each stratum is a memory, a burnt floor, a fallen wall, a pot handle smoothed by a vanished hand. When the spade touches one, centuries collapse. Stone meets daylight again, and dust rises like a ghost. In the late Bronze Age, around 1700 BCE, Troy VI rose. This was no legend, but a real city of stone ramparts 12 feet thick, sloped outward to resist assault. Its gates opened onto paved streets that climbed toward a citadel. Inside stood two-story homes with plastered walls, storage pits, wells, and courtyards shaded by vines. The people who lived here were merchants and sailors, artisans and scribes. They traded tin for copper to make bronze. They sent wool cloth and pottery to islands far away. At night, lamps of olive oil glowed behind small windows. Children slept beneath woven blankets. Dogs barked somewhere near the gate. From the walls, a sentry could see lights on the water ships passing through the strait and hear distant surf. Perhaps he wondered who sailed there and what they wanted. Centuries later, layers 7 and 8 would show traces of catastrophe. Arrowheads embedded in masonry, charcoal spread through what had been storerooms. One generation's dream became another's rubble. Earthquakes may have cracked the towers. Invaders may have finished the ruin. Whatever happened, the city that had stood for centuries fell silent. Yet people always returned. They built again atop the ashes, because the place itself, the crossroads of land and sea, refused to die. After 1200 BCE, the great powers of the Bronze Age collapsed. Trade routes broke apart, palaces burned, and writing itself nearly vanished from the region. For almost 1,000 years, Hisarlik slept beneath wild grass. Then, in the 19th century, a restless man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived with shovels, dynamite, and Homer's poems in his pocket. He was certain he could uncover the Troy of epic fame. He did uncover a city several, in fact, but his eagerness tore through centuries at once. In cutting a deep trench, he destroyed much that later archaeologists would have treasured. Still, his reckless passion rekindled the world's fascination with Troy. Modern excavation began to repair his damage. Teams from Turkey, Germany, and the United States mapped every wall, every shard. Carbon dating confirmed the timeline. Satellite imagery traced ancient riverbeds now buried under farmland. Bit by bit, Troy emerged not as myth, but as a sequence of real human communities evolving through millennia. Stand there today, and you can feel both presence and absence. The stone foundations warm under the sun. The wind off the sea whispers through dry weeds. Somewhere a cicada rattles. You look west and see the glimmer of the Aegean, east toward the rolling Anatolian plateau. Between those two horizons flowed everything that made the ancient world trade, war, migration, and the eternal wish to build something that lasts. The story of Troy is therefore not one of heroes or gods. It is the story of people whose ordinary lives were shaped by geography and chance. Their homes rose where continents touch, and because of that, the currents of history never left them in peace. The same narrow strait that brought prosperity also brought danger. Merchant ships could as easily carry soldiers as spices. And in the layers of burned grain and broken pottery, we see the rhythm that repeats across all time. Build, prosper, fall, rebuild. When archaeologists sift the soil of Hisarlik, they uncover seeds of barley, fish bones, bits of jewelry, the handle of a jug. They find human skulls crushed under collapsed beams. These are the true relics of Troy. Not treasures of gold, but traces of endurance. Imagine the city at sunset in its prime. The walls glowing red, sails on the horizon, voices calling from the harbor. Somewhere, a bronze smith quenches a blade in water. A woman grinds grain at a stone mill. Children chase one another through dust that still remembers older footprints. No gods intervene, no prophecies hang in the air. Only people, alive in their moment, believing the world would continue tomorrow. Yet even as they worked, change approached. The climate cooled, harvests failed, empires to the east faltered. Traders brought rumors instead of silver. One season the caravans stopped coming. Another, the ships failed to appear. And still, the Trojans endured, patching walls, storing grain, hoping the next spring would be kinder. History rarely grants warning. One year the city thrives, the next it burns. What remains afterward is neither glory nor shame, but the quiet evidence of existence, the angle of a wall, the soot on a hearthstone, a child's toy baked hard by fire. When you visit Troy now, you walk along paths laid out for tourists, past markers that read Troy the 6th, Troy the 7th, Troy the 8th. You pause at the reconstructed gate, look toward the plain, and realize how small the stage truly was on which such a vast story has been imagined. The war that poets later described may have been a border raid, a local dispute magnified by time, but that hardly matters. Every civilization turns its ruins into legends, because legends are easier to carry than dust. Before we leave this prologue, take another breath. The wind across Hisarlik is still blowing tonight. It carries the same salt from the Dardanelles, the same whisper that once brushed the faces of traders, soldiers, and children who called this hill their home. In that wind lives a reminder. Nothing we build is permanent, yet nothing we build is truly lost. Beneath every field, beneath every city, the human story continues layer upon layer, waiting for the next curious hand to uncover it. Now that we've stood among the quiet ruins of Troy, it's time to lift our eyes and look outward to the world that made this city possible, and the world that finally outgrew it. Troy did not rise in isolation. It was born of geography, shaped by winds, rivers, and the thin blue line of the Dardanelles that separates two continents. To understand Troy, we must understand the land between. The morning light spreads slowly across northwestern Anatolia. From the sea, the hills appear as rippling folds of bronze and green. The plain below is narrow, hemmed in by the Ida Mountains to the south and the strait to the west. It's a landscape both generous and cruel, fertile enough to feed thousands, but exposed to every ambition that sails by. For millennia, this region was a threshold. Europe on one side, Asia on the other. Empires would spend their strength trying to own that threshold, but it never truly belonged to anyone for long. Thousands of years before Troy the Sixth's high walls gleamed in the sun, caravans had already crossed this strip of earth. Tin from the east, copper from Cyprus, obsidian from Cappadocia, all met here, traded for amber, wool, and olive oil. The Dardanelles was the narrow throat through which the commerce of the Bronze Age world had to pass. Those who lived at its mouth could sip the wealth that flowed through or choke it off entirely. Geography, more than legend, explains Troy's endurance. The site commanded a rare combination of elements: access to fresh water, arable soil, shelter from harsh north winds, and proximity to the sea. To the north lay the Black Sea, rich in grain and timber. To the south, the Aegean, alive with islands that formed stepping stones to Crete and beyond. Between them, a city at Hisarlik could watch, tax, and trade with both worlds. But the same geography that nurtured prosperity also invited peril. Every power that wanted a share of the strait had to pass Troy's gaze. Traders came with smiles, soldiers came with fire. The Trojans learned to read the horizon, the difference between the white sails of merchants and the darker, low-cut hulls of warships. The narrow plain offered no deep refuge. Their only safety was vigilance and the loyalty of neighbors who shared the same risks. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, this region was already a network of settlements and routes. Inland lay the great Hittite Empire, whose archives at Hattusa mention a vassal kingdom called Wilusa. Scholars see in that name the echo of Ilios, Troy's older title. The Hittites knew its value. Wilusa guarded the western gateway to their dominion. Farther west, across the sea, the Mycenaeans rose in Greece palace, builders, traders, and occasional raiders. Between them stretched the Aegean, a corridor of exchange that could turn violent at any time. Archaeological evidence shows that Troy was part of this web. Imported pottery from the Cyclades, bronze tools cast in foreign molds, and seals inscribed with Anatolian hieroglyphs all testify to a cosmopolitan life. Its merchants might have spoken several tongues. Its scribes kept records in more than one script. When storms or politics closed other harbors, captains sought anchorage below Troy's walls, trading stories along with goods. Yet the land itself shaped behavior as much as commerce did. The winds that funnel through the Dardanelles can change without warning. Sailors learned to wait for calm before venturing through. For days, fleets would idle in sight of the city, their crews exchanging rumors, perhaps restless, perhaps afraid. From Troy's ramparts, the scene must have looked like a floating marketplace of nations. Every anchor dropped into the shallows was another coin tossed into the city's fortune. The Ida Mountains behind the plain were no less important. Their slopes held forests of oak and pine that supplied ship timbers and fuel for kilns. Streams ran down from hidden springs, feeding the Scamander and Simois rivers that wound past the city before meeting the sea. In dry summers, these rivers shrank to sluggish veins, but in winter they flooded, spreading new soil across the fields. Ancient farmers accepted this rhythm as life itself, planting after the floods, harvesting before the next. If you walk there today, you can still trace the ghost of that pattern. The modern landscape has shifted. The shoreline receded as the rivers dropped centuries of silt, but the bones of the land remain the same. Archaeologists use core samples to read it, like a diary, layers of pollen, ash, and clay that mark the turning of climates and the passage of civilizations. The earth remembers even when memory fails. For Troy's inhabitants, this memory was practical. They learned to build walls that sloped outward so floods would slide away, to store grain high above damp ground, to orient streets toward breezes that eased the heat. They adapted, and adaptation became tradition. Over centuries, that tradition hardened into identity. Trojans as keepers of the gate, mediators between east and west. That identity gave the city both strength and peril. For traders, Troy was a trusted hub. For ambitious kings, it was a prize too tempting to ignore. To hold Troy meant not just commanding a harbor, but controlling the conversation between civilizations. It was said that nothing moved between Asia and Europe without Troy knowing first. The Mycenaeans to the west were expanding then, their palaces glittering with bronze and gold. In their frescoes appear ships with high prows and curved oars, signs of a people who ruled the sea as much as the land. When Mycenaean pottery fragments show up in the ruins of Troy VI, we can imagine more than trade. We can sense the cautious friendship and wary rivalry that bind neighbors across water. Farther inland, the Hittite Empire viewed Wilusa as both partner and subject. Diplomatic tablets written in cuneiform reveal the delicate negotiations of that age. Treaties promised peace, yet every clause carried an undertone of suspicion. The kings of Wilusa pledged loyalty to the great king in Hattusa, but distance and ambition often strained that bond. When rebellion flared in western Anatolia, Wilusa's loyalty became a question and a risk. It's tempting to picture these ancient politics as distant abstractions, but they were lived by real people. A scribe in Wilusa might have spent long evenings copying treaty lines onto damp clay while listening to rain beat on the roof. A merchant, returning from the islands, might have unloaded tin ingots under the watch of soldiers who spoke a different language. The tension between cooperation and competition was daily life. The environment itself rewarded those who could balance both. The coastal plain could feed thousands, yet it was small, its soil easily exhausted. To survive, Troy needed trade. To trade, it needed peace. Its leaders probably spent more time negotiating grain shipments than plotting wars. The famous walls we admire today were not monuments to glory. They were insurance policies, reminders that prosperity attracts envy. And envy did come. Sometime around 1300 BCE, a major earthquake tore through the region, toppling parts of Troy the sixth ramparts. The city rebuilt quickly, its stones reset with even greater precision, the architecture more graceful. It's a rare case where destruction led to refinement. The inhabitants understood that their position between continents demanded resilience. Every tremor, whether of earth or politics, had to be met with calm rebuilding. What makes this land unique, even today, is that it holds both separation and connection in the same breath. Stand on the shores near Troy, and you can watch Europe and Asia facing each other across less than a mile of water. The tides here do not simply rise and fall, they exchange. The Black Sea sends its cooler, fresher current south. The Mediterranean pushes back with its warmer, saltier flow. That perpetual conversation of waters mirrors the human one above them. Exchange, resistance, renewal. In this environment, cultures mixed naturally. Pottery styles blended Aegean curves with Anatolian patterns. Religious symbols intertwined the double axe of Crete found beside local fertility figurines, the Hittite storm god beside household idols of the sea. The people of Troy probably spoke a language now lost, flavored with words borrowed from traders who came and went. Their identity was not singular but layered, like the soil beneath their feet. If we could stand in the marketplace of Troy on an ordinary morning around 1250 BCE, we'd see this blending everywhere. Stalls shaded by woven mats, merchants haggling in mixed tongues, bronze tools glinting beside baskets of figs and jars of olive oil. Children dart through the crowd while messengers deliver scrolls sealed in clay. From the citadel, officials watch with wary eyes, aware that peace is fragile and profit depends on it. When storms trapped ships in the bay, sailors filled the inns, telling stories of lands beyond sight. Some spoke of Hattusa's stone lions, others of Knossos' painted halls, still others of distant Egypt, where the Nile never sleeps. To the Trojans, these tales were not fantasy but geography, a map drawn in voices. They lived at the intersection of them all. Even religion reflected the crossroads. The sanctuaries within Troy's walls were modest compared to later temples, but they served as places of offering for travelers. Archaeologists have found small altars, burnt bones of sacrificed animals, and vessels used for libations. The gods of this land were practical ones, protectors of harvest, wind, and journey. Pilgrims and sailors alike must have stopped to thank them before facing the strait's unpredictable currents. The seasons dictated the rhythm of existence. In spring, caravans arrived from the east, laden with metals and fabrics. In summer, the harbors swelled with ships bound for the Aegean. Autumn brought harvest festivals and the repairing of nets. Winter was a time of watchfulness, when sudden storms or distant wars could cut supply lines. Each cycle stitched Troy tighter into the fabric of the world, until it became indispensable, and therefore vulnerable. What we call the land between continents was not simply geography. It was a living system of exchange that defined identity. The Trojans were neither purely Eastern nor purely Western. They were both and more. That duality became their power and their fate. When conflict finally erupted between the Mycenaean world and the Anatolian states, Troy found itself in the middle, unable to choose a side without losing itself. By the close of the Late Bronze Age, the calm between these powers had grown thin. Droughts spread across the region, driving migrations known later as the movements of the Sea Peoples. Grain prices soared, Trade faltered. Cities fortified their walls higher than ever. In this atmosphere of fear and scarcity, any spark could ignite war. And somewhere on that narrow plain between the mountains and the sea, a city that had stood for centuries braced for the tide to turn once more. The world around Troy was changing. The same winds that once carried merchants now carried soldiers, and the calm waters of the Aegean began to mirror the tension of kings and empires. To the east, the Hittite Empire reached its height, a vast domain of stone cities, iron weapons, and bureaucratic order. To the west, the Mycenaean world flourished, with palaces gleaming across the Greek mainland, their rulers hungry for trade, tribute, and fame. Between them, Troy stood like a bridge built over troubled waters, too valuable to ignore, too independent to control. The Bronze Age was nearing its climax. Across the eastern Mediterranean, civilizations were linked by trade routes that glittered like veins of metal: copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, gold from Nubia, ivory from Syria, olive oil and wine from the Aegean. In this delicate network, Troy was both participant and gatekeeper. Every ship that crossed the Dardanelles owed a quiet debt to its watchful walls. The city prospered, but prosperity is rarely silent. With wealth came envy, and with envy came the eyes of rising powers. To understand Troy's fate, we must first meet its neighbors, the giants of the age. Eastward stretched the Hittite Empire, whose kings ruled from the fortified capital of Hattusa, deep in central Anatolia. From there, they commanded armies of chariots and scribes who filled clay tablets with every treaty, every prayer, every quarrel. The Hittites spoke of loyalty and order, but their empire was a living thing, breathing war as much as peace. Their borders touched Troy's world through the lands they called Arzawa and Mira. Within their archives, scholars found names that echo across millennia: Wailusa, Tarusa, and Alexandua king, whose treaty with the Hittites may preserve the earliest whisper of the name Alexander, long before Macedon was born. Far across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms were rising too. They were not a single empire, but a constellation of rival palaces: Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, Thebes, each ruled by a Wanax, a warlord king who gathered tribute from the countryside and sent ships to trade or raid as opportunity allowed. Their artisans carved lions above gateways and painted frescoes of bull leapers and dancers, but beneath the art lay ambition. They sought medals, slaves, and glory. The Aegean was their mirror and their weapon. Between these two great worlds, Hittite and Mycenaean Troy stood as a mediator. Its language may have blended Anatolian roots with Aegean words. Its diplomacy balanced the pride of both. Letters recovered from Hattusa hint at disputes between the Hittite king and his western vassals over Wailusa. One text tells of a rebellion in which the city changed sides, prompting a campaign to restore order. We can't know the details, but the tone is clear. The western coast of Anatolia was a place where allegiance was fluid and every alliance temporary. For centuries, Troy managed the balance. It supplied metals to Mycenaean smiths, offered safe harbor to traders, and maintained respectful distance from Hittite demands. The flow of goods enriched it: amber from the Baltic, lapis from Afghanistan, spices from the Levant, all passed through its gates. Yet with each generation, the pressure grew. The Hittites wanted obedience. The Mycenaeans wanted access. Both wanted security. To them, Troy was a key, and keys are meant to turn. Archaeology reveals hints of the city's adjustment to these pressures. The fortifications of Troy VI were not only massive, but sophisticated. Their sloped walls and projecting bastions suggest engineers who understood siegecraft, perhaps learned from watching other cities fall. Inside, the citadel expanded to include storerooms for grain and water cisterns deep enough to withstand a siege. This was a community preparing for uncertainty. Still, life within those walls remained vibrant. Workshops produced fine pottery, with geometric motifs shared across the Aegean. Traders recorded shipments of oil and textiles on wooden tablets, now long decayed. Women likely oversaw households and weaving rooms. Men farmed, sailed, or served in the city guard. Children learned to read the stars and the currents, for Troy's future always lay in knowing the world beyond sight. By the 13th century BCE, the storm clouds were gathering. Across the Mediterranean, migrations and famines disrupted trade. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries began to wobble. The Hittite Empire stretched itself thin, fighting on multiple fronts. The Mycenaean world faced unrest at home. In such times, the temptation to seize a rival's wealth or his trade route becomes hard to resist. In this uncertain age, a single spark could ignite decades of memory. Later poets would call it the Trojan War, but for the people who lived through it, it may have been one more in a long line of regional conflicts, born not of beauty and vengeance, but of hunger and fear. The Aegean world of the 13th century BCE was a mosaic of ambition. Each Mycenaean king ruled from his citadel like a sun around which smaller stars revolved. Mycenae itself, the richest and most formidable, was said to possess a treasury of gold. The palace walls were painted with scenes of warriors and chariots. Its storerooms overflowed with jars of oil and wine sealed for export. To rulers like these, Troy's harbor glittered like an unopened chest. Whoever controlled it could dictate the rhythm of trade between continents. And so, across the blue sea, emissaries began to cross, some bearing gifts, some bearing threats. Mycenaean pottery appears in greater quantities at Troy VII, while in Greek sites, Anatolian-style artifacts increase in turn. Such finds tell of contact, negotiation, and perhaps intimidation. Trade and diplomacy often walk together, one hand extended in friendship, the other resting on a sword. Meanwhile, the Hittites struggled to hold their vast realm together. Internal revolts, foreign invasions, and droughts strained their resources. In this turbulence, Wilusa's allegiance mattered. A loyal Troy meant stability on the western flank. A rebellious Troy invited Aegean intrusion. The Hittite kings wrote of envoys, of disputed borders, of small wars waged by proxy. To them, this corner of Anatolia was both far away and dangerously close. If Troy's rulers played both sides, it was not out of deceit but survival. Diplomacy was their craft. They likely hosted envoys from both powers, pouring wine from local vineyards and assuring each guest that peace was in everyone's interest. For a while, that delicate theater held. But the world beyond Troy was unraveling faster than anyone could mend. Climate records taken from tree rings and lake sediments show a period of prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Harvests failed, migrations increased, and the great trade network that had sustained the Bronze Age began to break apart. With fewer ships on the sea, pirates filled the void. They came not for trade but plunder. To defend themselves, coastal cities fortified, hoarded, and distrusted. The old balance between commerce and security collapsed. In this environment, one misunderstanding, one insult, or one opportunistic raid could cascade into catastrophe. If a Mycenaean fleet attacked Troy, it might have done so for the oldest of reasons, to control the gate between seas. The later poets would dress that reason in silks and stories, speaking of stolen queens and divine wrath. But beneath the verse lies a simpler truth war for access, not romance. Troy VIII, the layer many scholars associate with the conflict, bears marks of violent destruction. Charred timbers, collapsed walls, and human remains found in doorways suggest a city taken by storm. Yet the archaeological record also shows rebuilding afterward, proof that life persisted. Even in ruin, Troy's resilience endured. What is most striking is how quickly the entire world around it fell silent soon after. Within a generation, the Mycenaean palaces burned. The Hittite Empire vanished from history, its capital abandoned to weeds. The sea routes went quiet, writing ceased, and the long twilight known as the Bronze Age collapse began. From this darkness, only fragments survive. Broken tablets, scarred pottery, faint echoes of names once powerful. Troy's fall was not unique. It was part of a greater unraveling. But because its story lingered in song, it became a symbol, a lens through which later ages would view the end of an era. If we stand again on the hill of Hisarlik and imagine that final summer, we might see smoke rising in the distance, not yet from Troy itself, but from its neighbors. Refugees arrive at the gates. Merchants whisper of burned ports. The price of grain doubles. The city's leaders debate whether to open or close their harbor. They send messengers to allies who never return, And somewhere beyond the horizon, a fleet assembles under banners whose colors no one in Troy has ever seen. The rest is conjecture, but history often demands imagination to fill the silence. Perhaps the attackers expected an easy conquest. Perhaps the defenders believed their walls could never fall. In the end, both were wrong. When the flames finally reached the citadel, they consumed more than buildings. They consumed an entire way of life. The age of bronze and chariot, of palace scribes and sealed treaties, ended there on the edge of two continents. When the fires died, survivors drifted away. Some resettled among the ruins. Others vanished inland. The once busy strait fell quiet, except for the cries of gulls. Centuries would pass before new cities rose along its shores, unaware that beneath their feet lay the bones of an older greatness. The world of the Bronze Age had been woven like a vast net, its strands made of trade, tribute, and trust. For centuries, kingdoms across the Mediterranean had exchanged not only goods but knowledge, faith, and identity. The collapse of that net did not come as one great snappet frayed first, strand by strand, until the pattern was lost and the sea grew empty of sails. The first signs of trouble came quietly. Drought crept across Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant. Harvests failed, rivers shrank, and herds wandered farther each season in search of grass. A few years of bad weather might have been endured, but this was something larger, a slow, relentless decline that starved both field and city. When granaries emptied, markets turned violent, and when famine set in, even kings grew desperate. At the same time, movement began on the edges of the known world. Peoples from the north and west, perhaps driven by their own scarcity, set sail in loose confederations, raiding and migrating along the coasts. Egyptian scribes would later call them the Sea Peoples, describing battles against fleets of foreigners whose origins were as shifting as the tide. They were less an army than a symptom, a sign that the old stability had broken. In Anatolia, the great Hittite empire, long the guardian of the interior, buckled under pressure. Its vassal states rebelled, its supply lines failed, and the proud capital of Hattusa was abandoned to weeds and silence. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean citadels followed. One after another, the palaces that had gleamed with bronze and gold went up in flames. The scribes fled. The artisans vanished. Only ashes remained. Troy did not escape. Whether destroyed by foreign attack, earthquake, or the slow suffocation of trade, its end was part of the same unraveling. The archaeological record at Hisarlik speaks of violent fire, sudden abandonment, and then quiet rebuilding, smaller, poorer, but alive. The city did not die all at once. It shrank, adapted, endured in miniature. For the people who lived through it, the collapse was not a story but a series of hard choices. Do we stay and defend the walls, or flee and hope for better land? Do we sow seed in dry earth, or eat it to survive the winter? There were no grand battles here, only the daily war against hunger and uncertainty. Trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, ceased to flow. Without copper and tin, the alloy that had defined their world became rare. The age of bronze ended not with invention but with exhaustion. Farmers turned back to simpler tools of stone and wood. Warriors fought with iron only when luck or salvage provided it. The grandeur of empire gave way to the humility of survival. And yet, amid this darkness, there was light, the stubborn light of human continuity. Families carried fragments of their culture wherever they went. A song, a carving, a habit of prayer. The myths that would later blossom in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant were seated here, in the memory of collapse. Out of ruin came reinvention. In the ruins of Troy, life returned in modest form. The people built smaller houses atop the massive foundations of the old citadel. They tilled the same fields, fished the same rivers, and spoke new dialects born of mingled survivors. What had once been a crossroads of empire became a quiet village, its glory buried but not forgotten. If you were to stand there then, around 1100 BCE, the silence would feel heavy but not hopeless. The wind would still carry the scent of salt from the strait. Children would still laugh as they chased one another across stones that once formed palace floors. Life had narrowed, but it continued. Across the wider world, the same pattern unfolded. In Cyprus, copper mines fell silent. In the Levant, cities once rich with trade turned to dust. Egypt, battered but enduring, fought desperate battles to keep its borders intact. In distant Mesopotamia, scribes complained that caravans no longer arrived from the west, that tin, the blood of bronze, had vanished from the markets. Everywhere, records end abruptly. The rhythm of accounting, of royal decrees and merchant tallies simply stops. When writing ceases, it is not just bureaucracy that dies, but memory itself. The next generations would inherit a world they could no longer read. This silence is why archaeologists call it a collapse rather than a transition. Civilization did not migrate or evolve, it fell. Systems too complex to sustain themselves imploded, and the survivors had to reinvent life from the ground up. In that reinvention lay the seeds of the future. Iron smelting, once rare, began to spread. New cultures, Phrygians, Lydians, early Greeks, rose from the fragments of the old. They built not upon palaces, but upon villages, their societies simpler, more flexible. The darkness that followed the Bronze Age was real, but it was also fertile soil for renewal. For Troy, the renewal came slowly. The once grand city became a provincial town, then a memory. The Dardanelles remained vital, yet the world had shifted its roots. Trade now followed new paths, and power drifted south toward Phoenicia and the Levant. Still, the hill of Hisarlik endured, a quiet witness to the resilience of place. Centuries later, Greek settlers would arrive and recognize the site's grandeur. They would call it Iliad, honoring legends already growing in the oral traditions of their ancestors. To them, the ruins were sacred, the resting place of heroes, the echo of an age they could barely imagine. And so, myth began to grow where history had burned away. But before poetry came survival. For the people living among Troy's ashes, myth had no meaning yet. They were not heroes of song, but farmers, potters, fishers. They patched their walls, prayed for rain, and taught their children the new ways of a humbler world. In their endurance lay the truest story of all, that humanity does not end when kingdoms fall. If you walk those hills, then you might find a woman grinding grain beside stones that once formed a temple. You might meet an old man who still remembered the sea filled with ships, now telling children who had never seen one. Their lives, smaller but no less real, carried the embers of continuity. The Great Collapse, for all its devastation, was not a void but a transformation. It stripped away the layers of empire and revealed something older and simpler beneath the basic rhythm of life and loss, planting and harvest, hope and fear. From that simplicity, the next chapter of human history would begin. When modern archaeologists unearth these layers, they find not despair but adaptation. Tools evolve, pottery changes shape, settlements shift to higher ground. The people of the post-collapse world were not passive victims. They were the architects of survival. The very word resilience could have been born here, in the stubborn persistence of those who refused to vanish. Standing atop Hisarlik today, one can sense that endurance. The wind that howls across the site is the same that once carried ashes from fallen walls. The soil beneath your feet still holds fragments of burned clay. Seeds turned to carbon, and bones turned to dust. Yet around them, wildflowers bloom. History's most profound truth may be this: even collapse contains the promise of renewal. The Bronze Age world ended, but humanity did not. The torch passed unseen from hand to hand, through centuries of silence, until new voices rose to speak again. And when they did, when poets began to sing of heroes and lost cities, they gave names to the ghosts that had endured in memory all along. Among those names, one shone brightest: Troy. The fires of the Bronze Age had cooled, leaving behind ash, silence, and the faint shimmer of memory. For centuries after the Great Collapse, the world seemed smaller, simpler. Trade had faded, writing had gone quiet, and the once mighty palaces of Mycenae, Hattusa, and Troy were only hills of broken stone. Yet memory, like a seed buried deep in winter soil, waited for spring. Out of the ruins, stories began to grow. They were not written at first, only spoken, passed from mouth to mouth, from campfire to temple, from one generation that remembered fragments to another that shaped them into meaning. Somewhere along the Aegean coast, perhaps in the 8th century BCE, singers began to weave those fragments into songs. They sang of lost cities and forgotten kings, of voyages and wars that had happened so long ago that time itself had become uncertain. The stories stretched across centuries like bridges over fog, linking the dim Bronze Age past to the new Iron Age dawn. And at the heart of those songs, gleaming like a half-buried jewel, was the name of a city that had once guarded the Dardanelles, Troy. To the people who first heard these tales, Troy was both familiar and remote. They could sail past the ruins. They could walk its earth, yet it belonged to a time beyond memory. The storytellers, oidoi, as the Greeks called them, gave that distance shape. They sang of 1,000 ships, of a war fought for honor and love, of gods who meddled and heroes who defied them. What had once been trade and politics became passion and destiny. History, stripped of its walls and tools, clothed itself again in poetry. It was not deceit, it was transformation. The oral poets were not historians, they were guardians of emotion. They took the ache of a vanished world and turned it into rhythm and meter, so that loss could be carried, not forgotten. Every time a bard sang of Troy's fall, he was not only recounting the death of a city, but the death of an entire age, and in doing so, he kept it alive. The songs changed with each singer. A generation that knew the ruins firsthand might remember where the rivers flowed, the way the wind bent the grass. Their children would add details borrowed from their own wars and voyages. By the time of Homer, if indeed there was one poet who shaped the Iliad and the Odyssey, Troy had already become more than a place. It was a symbol of everything fragile and fierce in human ambition. The Iliad does not tell the whole war, only a few weeks near its end. Yet within those verses lies the echo of centuries. When Achilles rages, when Hector stands upon the walls, when Priam kneels to beg for his son's body, the poem speaks for all who have lived and lost amid the ruins of history. It transforms the smoldering stones of Hisarlik into a mirror of the human condition. The city is no longer just Troy, it is every place where pride meets grief. For the Greeks of the early Iron Age, these stories served a purpose deeper than memory. They offered identity. In a world rebuilding itself after collapse, people needed roots that stretched beyond the reach of their own lifetimes. The epics of Troy gave them that, a heroic ancestry, a sense that they were descendants of those who had stood at the turning point between ages. In that sense, myth became architecture, a foundation for culture. By the 7th century BCE, the ruins of Hisarlik had already become a site of pilgrimage. Travelers from the Greek mainland and the islands came to see the legendary city. They found weathered stones, broken walls, and windswept plains. But to them, it was sacred ground. Offerings were left at shrines that may once have been houses. Poets walked among the rubble, composing lines that merged geography with imagination. The past and present overlapped like layers of Troy itself. Archaeologists centuries later would find traces of that reverence, Greek pottery shards amid the older debris, coins bearing images of heroes, even crude altars built on Bronze Age foundations. The site had become a living myth, fed by those who sought to touch the edge of eternity. The transformation of Troy from ruin to legend is one of humanity's most profound acts of storytelling. In myth, the city never truly falls. Each retelling rebuilds it anew, stronger and more beautiful than before. Even its destruction becomes an act of creation, the birth of narrative. The Iliad may have begun as an elegy, but it became a blueprint for Western literature. Its rhythms echo in every tragedy, every tale of love and loss told since. Yet beneath the poetry, something of the real Troy persists. Archaeology confirms that a powerful city stood where the legend placed it, that it burned, and that it rose again. The details blur, but the core remains true. People lived, built, and fought on that hill. They dreamed, feared, and endured. The myth magnifies them, but it does not invent their existence. As the Iron Age matured, the Greeks turned these myths into markers of geography. They named capes and rivers after heroes. They traced their ancestry to warriors of the Trojan plain. City-states competed for fragments of the story, claiming descent from Aeneas or Achilles or Hector. In this way, myth became a mappa, spiritual topography, that connected every shore of the Aegean to the ashes of Troy. Centuries passed, and the myth traveled farther. When Greek colonies spread along the coasts of Asia Minor, they carried the memory of Troy with them like a talisman. To settlers carving out new lives in foreign lands, the story of a doomed but glorious city spoke of both warning and hope. It reminded them that greatness could be built and lost, but also that from loss comes renewal. By the time classical Greece reached its height, Troy had become the touchstone of imagination. Playwrights, sculptors, and historians all returned to its walls for inspiration. Euripides wrote of the women left behind in the smoking ruins. Sophocles gave voice to heroes facing destiny. Later, historians like Herodotus treated the Trojan War as the first great conflict between East and West, a prelude to their own struggles against Persia. Through them, Troy became not just a story but a metaphor, a lens through which the Greeks saw themselves and their world. The Romans, too, claimed the legend. They believed that their ancestor Aeneas, a prince of Troy, had fled the burning city and sailed west to found a new nation. Virgil's Iliad transformed the myth again, linking the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome. In that single poetic gesture, Troy's ashes became the soil from which another empire would grow. The story had completed its circle. A city destroyed at the meeting point of continents now gave birth to the empire that would rule them both. For more than 1,000 years, poets, priests, and scholars debated whether the war had truly happened. Some sought proof, others said it did not matter. The value of the story lay not in its accuracy but in its meaning. It spoke to pride and folly, to love and endurance. It taught that even the mightiest walls cannot shield the heart from time. Still, the question persisted. Was Troy real? Generations of travelers searched the coasts of Anatolia, guided only by the lines of Homer and the whispers of locals. Some pointed to distant hills, others claimed the ruins near modern-day Hisarlik matched the poet's description. But the world changed, and faith in the old stories waned. By the Middle Ages, Troy lived mostly in books and dreams. Then, in the 19th century, the story breathed again. A man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived on the windswept mound of Hisarlik with a spade in one hand and Homer in the other. He was no trained archaeologist, but he had conviction, perhaps too much of it. In his zeal to find the treasure of Priam, he dug too deeply, cutting through centuries of history. Yet even in his recklessness, he proved something extraordinary. Beneath the earth, there truly were cities upon cities, layers of human life reaching back 5,000 years. Schliemann's trenches revealed that myth and history were not enemies but companions. Hisarlik was not just a poetic invention. It was a palimpsest of civilizations. The poet's Troy may never have existed exactly as sung, but the ground itself had held the truth all along. After Schliemann came others, Calvert, Dierbfeld, Blegen, Korfmann, each bringing new methods and greater patience. Bit by bit, they restored context to what enthusiasm had disturbed. Stratigraphy replaced speculation. Pottery and carbon dating replaced conjecture. Beneath Schliemann's chaos emerged a clearer vision. 9 major cities, each built upon the ruins of its predecessor, spanning more than 3 millennia of human history. Troy, it turned out, was not a single city but a continuum, a story of endurance written in stone. The myth had preserved its name. Archaeology gave back its reality. Between the two lies the truth of human memory. We dream because we forget, and we dig because we remember. Standing atop Hisarlik today, you can see both the poet's vision and the archaeologist's labor. The plain of the Scamander lies quiet under the sun, dotted with fields and olive trees. To the west, the Dardanelles shimmer, carrying ships whose engines hum where oars once splashed. To the east, the hills of Anatolia fade into heat. The view changes with the hour, but the feeling does not, an awareness of standing between myth and matter, between what was and what we need to believe. Visitors speak in hushed tones here, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts. They walk along reconstructed walls, peer into ancient gates, and try to imagine the roar of chariots, the cries of the besieged. Yet the real power of Troy lies not in the echo of war but in the whisper of continuity. For thousands of years, through conquest and decay, this hill has never been entirely abandoned. Something in it refuses to yield. Perhaps that is why the story endures. The myth of Troy is not simply about heroes or gods. It is about the persistence of meaning. Every age finds its own reflection in those ruins. For the Greeks, it was heroism. For the Romans, destiny. For the modern world, discovery. Each retelling adds a new layer to the mound, another city built upon memory. History and myth, far from rivals, form a single fabric. One gives shape to what can be touched. The other gives life to what cannot. Without myth, history is cold stones and dates. Without history, myth drifts untethered. But together, they remind us that humanity's greatest monuments are built not of marble or bronze, but of stories, the only structures that time cannot bury. So when evening comes, and the last light slides off the walls of Hisarlik, pause for a moment. Feel the wind from the sea, the same wind that once filled the sails of merchants and warriors alike. It carries voices older than language, the breath of all those who lived, fought, dreamed, and sang here. Their city has fallen 1,000 times, and risen 1,000 more in memory. That is the real Troy. Not lost, not found, but eternal. Rebuilt each time someone speaks its name. The dust of centuries never truly settles on Troy. Even after its walls had fallen and its story faded into song, the hill of Hisarlik remained a magnet for empire. Each new conqueror who crossed the Dardanelles felt its pulla, low, silent presence, overlooking the strait, older than their ambitions and indifferent to them all. Long after Homer's verses spread across the Aegean, the ruins drew the curious and the devout alike. By the time Alexander of Macedon marched east in the 4th century BCE, the legend of Troy had become part of his inheritance. As a boy, he had grown up reading the Iliad by lamplight, tracing his lineage to Achilles himself. When he reached the Troad with his army, he stopped before crossing into Asia and made his first pilgrimage not to a temple of the gods but to the windswept plain of Troy. Ancient writers tell us that Alexander offered sacrifices to Athena, the city's ancient protector, and laid a wreath on the supposed tomb of Achilles. He ran naked around it in the old athletic rite of homage, declaring himself the hero's successor. Whether the event happened exactly that way hardly matters. What matters is what it meant. For Alexander, standing among the broken stones of Troy was not nostalgia, it was prophecy. The boy who had read of conquest in Homer's pages now stepped into history to live it. After Alexander's death, his successors fought over his empire. But Troy, by then called Ilion, enjoyed renewed fame. The Hellenistic kings rebuilt parts of the city, raising temples and theaters over the older ruins. The site became both sanctuary and symbol, a place where myth and empire embraced. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to honor the heroes, to walk where they believed Achilles and Hector had fought, to leave offerings in gratitude or ambition. The plain of Troy became the stage upon which every later conqueror measured himself. When Rome rose, it too claimed kinship with Troy. Virgil's Aeneid had sealed the connection. Rome's founders were the children of a Trojan exile. To the Romans, visiting Troy was like visiting the womb of their own civilization. Julius Caesar and Augustus both paid homage there. The Emperor Hadrian ordered restorations of the temples. Coins were struck, bearing the image of Ilion. Under Roman rule, the city thrived again as a provincial town, small compared to its mythic stature, but alive, adorned with baths, statues, and colonnades. The layers of the mound thickened with marble and dust alike. The centuries turned, and empires shifted like tides around the strait. When Constantinople rose to the east, the Dardanelles became the lifeline of a new world, and Troy's ruins looked on from their familiar hill. Older than Byzantium itself, Christian pilgrims still passed by, whispering of the heroes as if they were saints from an earlier gospel. Some believed the War of Troy had foreshadowed their own struggles between faiths. Others saw it as mere fable, but the name endured. No map of the Aegean was complete without Ilion marked somewhere along the coast. The Byzantine era layered its own stories upon the landscape. Fortresses sprang up near the mouth of the strait, and villages grew among the ruins. Stone from Troy's ancient walls was quarried to build new homes, new churches, new defenses. The past literally became the foundation of the present. Every time a mason set one of those stones into a new wall, he joined myth and history with his hands. Then came the Ottoman Age, In 1453, when Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople, chroniclers recorded that he paused near the Trod and invoked the name of Troy. "We have avenged the sons of Priam," he supposedly declared, imagining himself as the heir to the eastern side of that ancient struggle. Whether or not he truly said it, the sentiment reflected the enduring magnetism of the story. Even the new world of Islam and gunpowder could not escape the shadow of Homer's war. Under Ottoman rule, the region around Hisarlik remained quiet, pastoral, remote, and layered with forgotten meanings. Travelers from Europe began to appear in the 17th and 18th centuries, their journals filled with speculation. Scholars argued over the location of the real Troy. Some pointed to Bunarbashi, farther south, where springs bubbled as Homer described. Others insisted the hill near the village of Hisarlik matched the poet's vision better. None could prove their case, but all agreed that somewhere in that landscape lay the cradle of their civilization's oldest story. By the dawn of the 19th century, curiosity had turned to obsession. The Enlightenment had taught Europe to seek proof, not just poetry. If Troy existed, they would find it. And so came a parade of explorers, surveyors, and dreamers, each armed with maps, compasses, and copies of the Iliad. The Trod became both a battlefield of scholarship and a stage for imagination. The land that had once inspired myth now lured science. In 1822, a British amateur named Charles Maclaren published one of the first serious arguments that the mound of Hisarlik matched the ancient descriptions. He studied the terrain, the rivers, the view toward the Aegean, and concluded that this modest hill concealed the bones of Homer's city. His idea was largely ignored at first, too simple, too far from the romantic visions of poets, but it planted the seed of modern archaeology's most famous quest. Half a century later, a German merchant turned adventurer named Heinrich Schliemann arrived to chase that dream. Wealthy from trade and restless in spirit, he had taught himself ancient Greek as a boy by reciting the Iliad aloud. To him, Troy was not just history, it was destiny. He came to the Trod in 1868, convinced that Hisarlik held the truth. Schliemann's methods were crude by today's standards, but his determination was volcanic. He hired local laborers, dug massive trenches through the mound, and in his zeal destroyed as much as he discovered. Yet his recklessness struck gold, literally. In 1873, he unearthed a cache of jewelry, cups, and weapons he called the treasure of Priam. Though later evidence showed it belonged to a city far older than Homer's Troy, the find electrified the world. For the first time, the myth had tangible weight. Europe's imagination caught fire. Newspapers printed illustrations of Schliemann's wife wearing the jewels of Helen. Scholars argued over his conclusions. Governments demanded the artifacts. Beneath the controversy, one truth stood firm. Troy was no longer a legend floating in Verset. It was a real place, layered beneath the Turkish soil. After Schliemann came Wilhelm Dörpfeld, a trained architect who brought order to enthusiasm. Dörpfeld refined the excavation, distinguishing the mound's many layers and identifying Troy VI and Vilikli belonging to the Late Bronze Age, the period of the supposed war. His careful mapping transformed archaeology from treasure hunting to disciplined science. In the 1,930 seconds, Carl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati continued the work, using improved methods to date pottery and reconstruct daily life. He confirmed that the city had indeed suffered violent destruction around 1,200 BCE, aligning eerily with the timeline of Homer's tale. Each generation of archaeologists added new pieces to the puzzle, and slowly the blurred line between myth and history came into focus. After World War II, Troy's story entered a new chapter of discovery. Excavations resumed under international teams, and technology replaced guesswork. In the late 20th century, Professor Manfred Korfmann led a project that would transform our understanding of the site. Using magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and aerial photography, his team revealed that the Troy of the Late Bronze Age was far larger than previously imagined. The lower city, once thought to be a mythic exaggeration, stretched well beyond the citadel walls, housing thousands of people and covering nearly 75 acres. What Schliemann had seen as a fortress was, in truth, a sprawling metropolis for its time. The new evidence painted a picture of a city both powerful and practical. Wide streets, drainage systems, granaries, and workshops. The mythic grandeur of Homer's Troy began to align with archaeological fact. Korfmann's findings ignited fresh debate among scholars. Could such a city have sparked the kind of conflict described in the Iliad? Could the Trojan War reflect a real struggle between Anatolian and Aegean powers at the twilight of the Bronze Age? The answers remained elusive, but the questions themselves renewed the site's vitality. Troy was no longer merely a monument to the past. It had become a living laboratory for understanding how memory, geography, and ambition intertwine. Today, the ruins of Troy rest beneath protective shelters, carefully preserved by Turkish archaeologists and UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Visitors wander through stone gates older than written Greek, past reconstructions of walls that once defied storms and armies alike. Signs mark the layers. Troy I through 9, a staircase of time rising toward the present. Standing there, it is impossible not to feel the weight of history and the strange intimacy of myth. Every empire that has touched this land, from the Hittites to the Ottomans, has left a trace upon it, each built upon the bones of the last, as if the earth itself demanded continuity. And yet, no ruler ever truly owned Troy. Its power lay not in possession but in presence, in the way it watches silently over the strait, eternal witness to the passing of ambition. When the evening wind rises off the Dardanelles, the sound moves through the ruins like breath through an ancient instrument. You can almost hear layers of language, the guttural tones of Hittite envoys, the lyrical Greek of Homeric recitations, the Latin prayers of Roman pilgrims, the Turkish songs of shepherds. Each voice belongs to a different age, but all speak to the same wonder that here, in this narrow place between continents, humanity has kept returning to build, to remember, and to seek meaning in the dust. As night falls, the lights of modern ships glide across the water, their reflections trembling like torchlight from another world. Somewhere beyond them lies the open sea, where trade and war and story once met. And on the hill of Hisarlik, the stones hold their silence, a silence that is not emptiness but fullness, the deep breath of history itself. The empires have gone. The excavations continue. The city endures, not because it still stands, but because it still speaks. Troy reminds us that time buries everything except the desire to know what came before. That desire is what keeps archaeologists digging, poets writing, and travelers standing in the wind, listening for echoes beneath the dust. In the 19th century, the winds that swept the Aegean carried not ships of bronze but ships of thought. Europe was in love with the past. Empires ruled the seas, museums rose like new temples, and scholars in dark libraries traced forgotten names through dust. The age of exploration had turned inward from the map of the earth to the map of time. Among the voices that stirred most restlessly in that age was one man who believed that poetry could lead him to truth, that verses older than history could guide a shovel through the soil of Asia Minor. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and his dream was Troy. He was born in 1,822 inches, the flat lands of northern Germany, the son of a poor pastor whose few possessions included a tattered copy of Homer. The boy's world was small, a parsonage, a field, a horizon of gray. Yet in the pages of the Iliad, he found a world vast enough to last a lifetime. He read of heroes, gods, and shining walls. And when his father told him that Troy was only a myth, the child refused to believe it. One day, he said, "I will find it." In that moment, the myth of Troy took root not in the earth, but in a mind. Schliemann's road to Hisarlik was neither straight nor scholarly. As a young man, he became a merchant, not a classicist. He taught himself languages: English, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, Russian, Greek, more than a dozen, and also he could trade anywhere in the world. He built his fortune in California's gold rush, in the coffee markets of Amsterdam, in the shipping houses of St. Petersburg. Yet even as wealth accumulated, the hunger for legend gnawed at him. He called it destiny. Others called it obsession. By middle age, he had everything that success could offer: money, freedom, and the leisure to pursue dreams. Most men would have bought estates or collected art. Schliemann bought a spade around 1,868. With Homer's Iliad and Odyssey as his compass, He set out for the coast of Asia Minor, convinced that the ancient city lay buried somewhere near the Dardanelles. Scholars had argued for centuries about Troy's location, some placing it at Bunarbashi, others at Hisarlik, but no one had proved anything. The land waited like a locked chest. At first glance, the mound of Hisarlik looked ordinary, a hill of stone and thistle rising above a plain where shepherds grazed their flocks. But to Schliemann's eye, trained by imagination more than science, it glimmered with possibility. The Iliad must be true, he wrote in his journal. If Homer sang of Troy, then Troy existed, and its ruins must still speak beneath this soil. In 1870 he began to dig. What followed was both magnificent and ruinous. Schliemann was no trained archaeologist. He believed that the past lay in a single layer, like a treasure chest waiting to be opened. To reach the Homeric age, he ordered his laborers to cut a vast trench straight through the mound, from summit to bedrock hauling, away centuries of earth and history alike. Villages, temples, pottery, bones all were flung aside in the race toward gold. He did not yet understand that Hisarlik was not one city but many, stacked one upon another like pages of a book. In tearing through them, he destroyed the very story he sought to read. Yet destruction and discovery are twins in every birth of knowledge. In 1873, amid the dust and debris of his reckless trench, Schliemann uncovered something that changed the world's imagination: a hoard of golden diadems, earrings, goblets, and plates, wrapped in a shawl and hidden beneath a stone wall. He called it the treasure of Priam. To him, it was proof shining, tangible proof that Homer's world had once been real. Schliemann described the moment in feverish prose. He claimed that as his workers paused for lunch, he alone saw the glint of metal in the soil. "I was trembling," he wrote. "An immortal joy took hold of me. I knew that the great king's treasure lay before my eyes. He gathered the gold in haste, hiding it from the Ottoman overseers, and smuggled it out of the country in his wife Sophia's shawl." The tale of the golden shawl became as legendary as Troy itself. The discovery electrified Europe. Newspapers from London to Vienna printed sketches of the treasure. Poets wrote odes to the modern conqueror of myth. Sophia Schliemann posed for photographers wearing the diadems, the jewels of Helen, as the press called them. To a world hungry for romance amid the steel and smoke of the industrial age, the news that Troy had been found felt like a miracle. The past had stepped out of poetry and into daylight, but the miracle carried shadows. Scholars soon realized that the layer from which Schliemann had taken the treasure was far older than the time of Homer, perhaps 1,000 years older. The gold belonged not to Priam, but to a forgotten Bronze Age city long before his. The real Troy of Homer, if it existed at all, lay above that level, partly destroyed by Schliemann's own trench. The dreamer had reached the wrong century, and in doing so, had erased evidence of the right one. Criticism rose like storm clouds. Archaeologists accused him of arrogance and vandalism. Governments accused him of theft. The Ottoman Empire demanded the treasure's return, claiming it as national property. Schliemann, stubborn as ever, smuggled much of it to Athens and later donated it to Germany. The gold passed from empire to empire like a relic of the very greed it symbolized, from Berlin's museums to the vaults of Moscow after World War II. Hidden for decades behind the Iron Curtain, even the treasure's afterlife mirrored the restless fate of Troy itself. Discovered, conquered, lost, and rediscovered again. Yet, amid the controversy, a new discipline was born. For all his recklessness, Schliemann had proven that Homer's world was not mere imagination, that the poetry of the Iliad rested upon a physical landscape. His discoveries inspired a generation of scholars to dig with purpose rather than chance. They learned to excavate layer by layer, to record artifacts with precision, to treat soil as a text rather than an obstacle. Out of his mistakes grew the science of modern archaeology. Schliemann himself learned too. In later excavations at Mycenae and Tiryns, he worked with greater care, uncovering the Lion Gate and the golden mask of Agamemnon. He still sought confirmation of Homer at every turn, but his methods had softened under the guidance of professional colleagues like Wilhelm Derbfeld. The merchant had become a scholar, though he never surrendered his theatrical flair. Derbfeld would later return to Hisarlik, and with steadier hands, reveal what Schliemann had missed. He distinguished 9 major layers of settlement, proving that Troy was not a single city but a succession of them, spanning more than 3,000 years. Among those strata, Troy the Sixth and stood out cities of the Late Bronze Age, with fortifications and ruins consistent with the era of the legendary war. The stones that Schliemann had blasted apart now spoke again through careful study. Science, born from zeal, began to heal what zeal had broken. Schliemann died in 1,890 inches Naples, after an ear infection turned fatal. He was 68, wealthy, celebrated, and still haunted by unfinished dreams. In his tomb on the hill of Ceramicus in Athens, his epitaph reads, "He who discovered the ancient Troy." Few epitaphs have been more contested, yet few have captured so precisely the blend of truth and myth that defined the man. He did find Troy, not the city of Homer perhaps, but the one that made Homer possible. He tore open the earth and, for better or worse, let history breathe. Today, archaeologists view Schliemann with equal parts admiration and regret. He was a visionary without method, a pioneer whose footsteps shattered the trail he blazed. Without him, Troy might still lie unknown. Because of him, part of it is gone forever. Yet that paradox is also the essence of discovery. To gain one thing, something else must be lost. The gold he unearthed gleamed for only a moment, but the light it cast on the human desire to know has never dimmed. If we could have stood beside him in that trench dust in our lungs, the sun fierce on the plain, we might have seen not a villain or a hero, but a man wrestling with time. Each blow of the pickaxe was an act of faith. Each stone lifted a prayer that the world of his childhood could still be found beneath the modern one. When he uncovered the first glimmer of gold, he was not merely proving a theory, he was touching a dream. The 19th century loved such dreams. It was an age of steam and skepticism, yet it longed for mystery. The rediscovery of Troy satisfied both. Science crowned with romance, progress wrapped in nostalgia. Schliemann became a symbol of that union, the self-made man who dared to turn myth into history. Painters depicted him as a modern Odysseus, explorers quoted him, and museums displayed his finds as if they were scripture. The world had found in him not just an archaeologist, but a mirror of its own ambition. In that sense, Schliemann's dream of gold was never only about metal. Gold was the color of proof, the gleam that turned belief into certainty. But beneath the gold lay something deeper, the yearning to touch the past, to hold in one's hands the evidence that stories endure. That yearning, once awakened, would drive archaeologists, historians, and travelers to Hisarlik for the next 2 centuries. Every trowel that scrapes its soil still echoes the rhythm of Schliemann's first trench. As the 19th century closed, the hill of Troy stood scarred but awakened. The winds blew through its cut face, exposing layers like lines of an ancient text. Above it, the modern world gathered tourists, scholars, dreamers, each gazing into the pit that divided ignorance from knowledge. Somewhere beneath that gaze, the last glints of the treasure of Priam faded into shadow, and in their place rose something more enduring, the birth of archaeology itself. Schliemann had sought a city, he found a century. He dug for kings and uncovered humanity. His dream of gold, for all its vanity, transformed the way we see the earth beneath our feet. The rest of us still live in the light of that revelation, still listening for the song of spades on stone, still believing against reason, and with hope that the past waits to be found. The story of Troy did not end with Schliemann's death. If anything, that was only the beginning of its modern life, the moment when the ancient city stepped fully into the age of science. The 19th century had found Troy. The 20th would learn to listen to it. When Wilhelm Dörpfeld took up Schliemann's mantle in the 1,890 seconds, he brought to the site what Schliemann had lacked: patience, precision, and respect for the passage of time. A trained architect, he read the mound not as a riddle to be solved, but as a structure to be understood. Layer by layer, he traced the city's evolution, mapping its walls, gates, and towers with the calm exactness of a surveyor rather than the fever of a treasure hunter. What he revealed changed everything. Troy was no single city swallowed by time, but a palimpsest of human endurance, 9 major layers, each built upon the bones of the last. The mound was a vertical history of civilization itself. D'Arpseld showed that Troy VI and the Great Late Bronze Age levels belonged to the period when both the Hittite and Mycenaean worlds flourished. In their walls of finely fitted limestone, in their arrowheads and burnt clay, scholars began to glimpse the shadow of the world Homer had sung. It was as if the city itself had been waiting for the right language to be spoken. Archaeology, once a quest for gold, was becoming a conversation with time. In the 1,930 seconds, the American archaeologist Carl Blegen continued that conversation with the meticulous care of a historian who understood both earth and evidence. Working under the blazing Anatolian sun, his team documented thousands of fragments, pottery, tools, bones, seeds, each catalogued and photographed. The romantic age of shovels and instinct had given way to the scientific age of trowels and data. Blegen's work confirmed that Troy had indeed suffered a violent destruction around 1200 BCE. He found collapsed walls, scorched floors, and skeletons lying where they had fallen, some clutching weapons, others trapped beneath debris. To him, these were not proof of Homer's exact war, but of something real and terrible that had inspired it. The lines between history and legend began to blur in the dust of evidence. Then came silence once again. The Second World War turned Europe into its own field of ruins, and for decades, Troy lay still under the Turkish sky, its trenches filling with weeds, its gates visited only by wind and goats. Yet even in neglect, it waited. In the late 20th century, technology gave archaeology new eyes. The spade was joined by the sensor, the trench by the satellite. What once took decades of digging could now be glimpsed from the air or traced by the pulse of radar beneath the ground. And when those new tools were turned toward Hisarlik, the city revealed a secret that Schliemann could never have imagined. Troy was far larger than anyone had thought. The man who led this revelation was Manfred Korfmann, a German archaeologist who arrived at Troy in 1988. He came not with dynamite or dreams of treasure, but with instruments, magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of international specialists. His goal was simple yet revolutionary: to see the unseen. What the instruments discovered astonished the world. Beneath the surrounding fields, outside the known citadel, they detected the outlines of streets, ditches, and walls, extending far beyond the previously excavated area. The lower city, long dismissed as a poetic exaggeration, was real and vast. It covered nearly 75 acres, enough to house thousands of inhabitants. The citadel of stone that Schliemann had torn through was merely the crown of a sprawling urban landscape. Korfmann's team uncovered traces of workshops, storage pits, and defensive ditches large enough to halt chariots. This was no mere fortress or royal acropolis. It was a city, state, commanding trade and power at the hinge of two continents. The Troy of Homer, alive with merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers, was no longer a fantasy. Its physical echo lay beneath the plow soil of the modern plain. The findings reignited debates that had smoldered for centuries. Scholars argued over the nature of the Trojan War. Was it myth built upon memory, or memory wrapped in myth? Some pointed to Hittite texts that mention Wilusa, a vassal kingdom on the western edge of Anatolia, whose name echoes Ilios, the Greek word for Troy. These tablets spoke of political intrigues and conflicts that eerily paralleled the outlines of Homer's tale. It seemed increasingly likely that the war for Troy had some foundation in history, though far smaller and more complex than poetry allowed. Science, once skeptical of legend, now began to bend toward it, not in surrender, but in recognition that myth and fact often grow from the same soil. As the 21st century dawned, Troy stood not as a battlefield, but as a symbol of preservation. In 1998, UNESCO declared the site a World Heritage Site, recognizing its global significance as one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. The decision marked a new chapter, the transition from excavation to conservation. The Turkish government, together with international partners, built protective shelters over the exposed ruins, installed walkways for visitors, and established the Troy Museum, a vast modern structure that now stands near the mound. Within its walls, artifacts spanning 5 millennia pottery, tools, figurines, gold ornaments are displayed not as trophies, but as storytellers. The museum's design mirrors the layers of the site itself, guiding visitors downward through time until they reach the deepest memory of all, the human desire to build, lose, and rebuild. Outside, the hill remains much as it always has, quiet, windblown, dotted with wildflowers. But now tourists walk its paths with headsets and guides, hearing voices that weave archaeology and myth into one. The air carries not the clang of tools, but the soft murmur of languages from every corner of the world. Troy has become what it once was, a meeting place of cultures, a crossroad between east and west. At sunset, when the light falls across the exposed stones, the ancient gate casts a long shadow toward the Aegean. It looks, as it must have looked 3,000 years ago, like the threshold between past and present. Modern science has stripped away neither Troy's mystery nor its magic, it has simply deepened both. Excavations in the early 2000s revealed that the city's inhabitants were skilled engineers, capable of complex drainage systems, fortifications, and urban planning. The citadel walls were sloped outward in the distinctive Hittite style, suggesting cross-cultural influence. Analysis of ceramic fragments traced trade connections stretching from the Balkans to Cyprus and Syria. Troy, it seems, was never isolated. It was a hub of exchange, a cosmopolitan node in the Bronze Age world system. Even the natural landscape tells part of the story. Geological surveys show that the coastline in the late Bronze Age lay much closer to the site than it does today. The Scamander and Simois rivers, whose names echo through Homer's lines, once formed a broad estuary where ships could anchor safely. Over millennia, silt carried by those rivers pushed the shoreline westward by several kilometers, leaving the city stranded inland, a slow geological metaphor for how history itself recedes. Pollen analysis reveals cycles of climate change that align with historical upheavals. Around 1200 BCE, droughts spread through Anatolia and the Aegean, likely contributing to famine, migration, and war, the very conditions that may have birthed the legend of Troy's fall. Science, like poetry, has learned to hear meaning in the whisper of the wind. And yet, for all our instruments and satellites, Troy remains partly unknowable. We can measure its walls and date its ashes, but not the thoughts of the people who built them. We can reconstruct the pattern of their streets, but not the sound of their laughter or the ache of their losses. What archaeology uncovers, myth restores to feeling. In the modern world, Troy means different things to different people. For historians, it is a key to understanding the Bronze Age collapse, the moment when interconnected civilizations fell like dominoes, reshaping the ancient world. For Turkey, it is a symbol of national heritage, proof that the crossroads of East and West was never a frontier but a heartland. For travelers, it is a pilgrimage site where legend and landscape embrace. And for poets and dreamers, it remains what it always was, a story about being human. Each generation remakes Troy in its own image. To the Victorians, it was proof that myth could become science. To the mid-20th century, it was a reminder of how civilization could crumble. To our century, it has become a meditation on preservation itself, how to protect not just stones but meanings. In an age of satellites and instant communication, Troy stands as a paradox, a place where slowness, patience, and silence reveal more than speed ever could. The archaeologist kneeling with a brush beside a half-buried wall is not so different from the bard leaning over his lyre, both listening for voices older than words. The site also raises questions that stretch beyond archaeology. What does it mean to own the past? Who speaks for a place that has belonged to so many? Hittites, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Ottomans, and now a modern nation-state. The debate over Schlieman's treasure, its journey from Turkey to Germany to Russia, still flickers in the halls of diplomacy, reminding us that even the relics of antiquity are caught in the politics of the present. The dream of gold endures, not as greed, but as the eternal negotiation between memory and possession. When night falls over the plain of Troy today, the ruins fade into silhouette, but the Dardanelles glimmer with the lights of modern ships, tankers, ferries, freighters crossing the same waters that once carried the ships of Mycenae. Their engines hum where oars once beat, their navigation lights blink where watchfires once burned. The sea remembers, even when we forget. Some visitors linger until after sunset, sitting quietly on the edge of the excavated walls. They watched the stars rise, the same stars that guided Bronze Age sailors, and feel an ancient closeness that no science can quantify. Beneath their feet lie the bones of forgotten generations. Above them stretches the infinite sky. In that moment, the distance between myth and modernity collapses. Perhaps that is Troy's greatest gift to the world today: perspective. It reminds us that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are temporary arrangements of hope against time. The Trojans built for eternity and fell. Schliemann dug for glory and was forgotten for a time. Empires rose and vanished around the same strait. Yet the hill remains quiet, enduring, patient. It teaches not despair, but continuity. To walk among its ruins is to walk among mirrors. Each stone reflects not only the ancient city but our own age, its ambition, its blindness, its longing to outlast itself. The tools have changed, the languages too, but the impulse is the same: to leave a mark that time cannot erase. Troy, at last, is no longer just a place. It is a question posed by history to every generation that gazes upon its dust. What will you build that endures? What stories will rise from your ruins? And so the hill of Hisarlik stands once more, between continents, between centuries, between legend and truth. Archaeologists still dig there every summer, their tents clustered like a small village beside the ruins. Students sift soil through mesh screens, labeling fragments that might, to others, look like nothing at all. The air smells of earth and sea salt. The cicadas sing their endless chorus, as they must have when the first stones were laid. Each fragment found is a sentence recovered from a lost language. Each measurement is a heartbeat restored to a civilization long silent. The work is slow, humble, and infinite. Yet in that slowness lies revelation. For what Troy finally teaches is not glory, but endurance, the quiet persistence of memory beneath the weight of years. As the modern world races ahead, Troy remains behind, whispering reminders to those who will listen, that knowledge is built upon patience, that every truth is layered, and that even the grandest legends are made of ordinary lives. The rediscovery continues, not in gold but in understanding. Beneath the dust, beneath the centuries, Troy still breathes. The wind over Hisarlik has never stopped. It moves across the dry grass and the pale stones, across centuries of silence and discovery, as if carrying the breath of all who have lived and died here. Evening comes softly, turning the plain below into bronze. Far beyond, the Dardanelles shimmer, a narrow ribbon of water where two continents meet, where myth was born and memory refuses to fade. Here, at the meeting of worlds, love and war both ended and began again in every generation that tried to remember them. For 3,000 years, the hill has watched. It has seen empires rise and vanish, seen gods traded for new names, seen the shape of ships and weapons and prayers change with time. And yet, through every age, people have come to stand in the same wind, to feel the same strange pull, the feeling that beneath this soil lies not just a city, but the truth of being human. We came to Troy to find a war, but found instead a mirror. Long before poets turned the battle into beauty, the people of Troy were like us. They built, hoped, feared, and loved. Their world, though smaller, was not simpler. They traded across seas, raised children, worried about harvests, and watched the horizon for storms both natural and human. When danger came, they defended what they had made. When ruin came, they rebuilt. Theirs was not the story of gods and heroes, but of endurance, the rhythm that binds every age to the next. Perhaps that is why the legend of Troy endures so deeply. The war of the Iliad is less about conquest than about what it means to lose what we love. Every reader, every listener across the centuries has heard in it a personal echo, the ache of pride, the price of beauty, the cost of remembering. The poets turned walls and battles into metaphors, but beneath the verse lies something eternal, the knowledge that no fortress, no love, no civilization can escape time. Even the gods of Homer, with all their power, could not stop fate. The lesson is older than scripture and more human than myth, that glory fades, but memory survives, that every ending carries the seed of another beginning. Walk the site today, and you will find no statues of Achilles or Hector. The heroes have vanished into dust, as all heroes must. What remains are the stones, their shapes softened by centuries of rain and wind, but still standing. The walls of Troy do not tower, they whisper. They do not speak of triumph, but of persistence. When you place your hand upon them, you feel not the grandeur of legend, but the pulse of continuity. Somewhere in the distance, a shepherd calls to his flock, and his voice carries across the same plain where chariots once thundered. The birds wheel above the ruins. The scent of wild thyme drifts on the air. It is quiet, yet full of presence, a silence so complete that you can almost hear history breathing. The archaeologists and tourists have gone for the day. The gates stand empty. The last light fades from the marble markers that read Troy the 6th, Troy the 7th, Troy the 8th. Each name is both a number and a rebirth, another layer in the long conversation between earth and time. The sun sinks, and for a moment, the stones glow like embers, as if the city is remembering its own fire. If love and war both ended here, perhaps they also began here. The same passions that burned in those ancient hearts still burn in ours. The jealousy of kings, the courage of defenders, the yearning for immortality. These are not relics. They are the architecture of human nature. The war for Troy was fought with spears and fire. Ours are fought with words and dreams. But the impulse is the same: to be remembered, to make meaning in a world that forgets. In the story, Helen's beauty is said to have launched 1,000 ships. But beauty, like truth, is only the spark. What truly moves armies is desire, the desire to possess, to control, to prove oneself against time. Troy became the stage upon which humanity first learned that desire and destruction are twins. Love reaches out, war answers, and both leave ruins behind. Yet those ruins are not empty. They are full of tenderness. The same walls that once echoed with battle now hold the footsteps of schoolchildren. The same plain that once drank blood now feeds wheat and wildflowers. Life, indifferent and forgiving, always returns. That may be the real victory of Troy. Not its fall, but its recovery. Not its death, but its endurance. As centuries passed, each age found its reflection here. The Greeks saw honor, the Romans saw destiny, the Byzantines saw prophecy. The Ottomans saw vengeance and continuity. The modern world sees heritage and identity. And yet beneath all these interpretations lies the same truth. Troy is a mirror for ambition and loss. Every civilization, sooner or later, builds its own Troy-some monument to greatness that time will one day reclaim. It might be a city, a nation, an idea. We raise it with pride, defend it with fervor, mourn it when it falls, and tell stories about it afterward, so that we may keep believing in ourselves. That is the endless cycle beneath the dust. To build, to burn, to remember. The Trojans did not know they were living in a legend. They simply lived. So do we. Our skyscrapers and satellites may feel permanent, but so did their walls once. Someday, someone may walk through our ruins and wonder what we dreamed of, what we feared, what songs we sang as our world trembled. Perhaps they will see us as we see Troy, distant, glorious, and strangely familiar. The archaeologist's brush and the poet's pen are kindred tools. Both uncover what time conceals. One frees the shape of a vessel, the other frees the emotion it once carried. Both remind us that history is not a straight line, but a spiral, a repetition of loss and rediscovery. Troy is proof that nothing human is ever truly lost, only transformed. In that sense, the hill of Hisarlik is not only a ruin but a living organism. It breathes the past into the present. The seeds that grow between its stones sprout from the same earth that once held the dead. The air itself feels older, heavier with stories. When you breathe it, you breathe through time. Night falls. The last birds settle. The sea turns black and gleaming. Lights from the far shore shimmer on the strait, each one trembling like a memory on the surface of water. The wind that began this story still moves, unbroken, from the Aegean toward the hills. It carries the scent of salt and earth, and something unnameable, the persistence of meaning. If you stand there long enough, you might begin to hear it. not the clash of armies or the cry of heroes, but a softer sound, like the murmur of voices half buried in the wind. They are not calling for vengeance or glory. They are whispering the oldest truth of all, that love and war are not opposites, but mirrors. One reveals the hunger for connection, the other, the fear of loss. Both are born of the same fire that built the first city and will build the last. And in that recognition, the story ends not with triumph, not with despair, but with understanding. Troy teaches us that impermanence is not failure. The fall of a wall is not the end of civilization, but part of its breathing. Every ruin holds the memory of effort, and every effort carries the seed of renewal. The Trojans built their city from stone. We build ours from data, steel, and dream. The materials differ, but the hope is identical. That something we make will outlast us. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to Hisarlik to measure ourselves against the silence. The archaeologist may seek evidence. The tourist may seek wonder. The poet may seek metaphor. But all are drawn by the same longing, to feel that our own fleeting lives are part of a larger story. When we leave Troy, the wind follows us. It carries fragments of the past in invisible currents, dust from the ramparts, the smell of grass, the echo of footfalls. It whispers that everything we build will one day return to the earth, but that meaning, once created, never dies. Far out on the Dardanelles, a ship passes. Its wake glows white under the moonlight, trailing a long ribbon of motion that fades into darkness. For a moment, it looks like one of the 1,000 ships from the legend, sailing forever toward a destiny already written. Then the illusion fades, and only the quiet remains. Somewhere on the hill, the cicadas still sing. The stars, the same stars that shone on Priam's palace and Schliemann's camp alike, burn over the silent stones. Time folds in on itself, and everything becomes one. The city that fell, the city that was found, the people who remember, and those who will come after. Troy has always been a meeting place of continents, of empires, of memory and imagination. It is the cradle of both history and story. Love and war both ended here, yes, but they also began again, in every telling, in every heart that listens. So let us leave the hill quietly, as the night deepens. The ruins behind us fade into shadow, but their presence remains a pulse beneath the surface of the world. The wind moves on, carrying with it the breath of all who once stood here. Somewhere in that wind, the city still lives. Every story ends where it began, and so does Troy. From dust to dream, from war to whisper, the city has moved through every chapter of human imagination. We began with legend, a world of gods and lovers, of beauty that burned cities. We walked through centuries of silence, through the rediscovery of a hill and the obsessions of men who sought gold and found ghosts. We watched as science replaced myth, only to discover that the truth of Troy was never one or the other, but both. 9 chapters later, the story has circled back to where it started, a city of memory, layered beneath time. The first chapters told of birth, of builders who laid the first stones beneath the Anatolian Sunday. They did not know that their walls would outlast empires. They only built because to build is human, because every civilization must try to leave its mark against oblivion. Then came the storytellers. Homer gave the city language, breath, immortality. Through his verses, the ruins found a second life in the minds of men. For nearly 3,000 years, Troy lived more vividly in poetry than in earth. But poetry, like time, cannot protect its subject forever. Centuries turned. Empires rose and fell. The name of Troy lingered, but the place itself faded into myth, a shadow on the map of memory. Until a merchant named Heinrich Schliemann, part dreamer, part destroyer, arrived to prove the unprovable. His shovel cracked the silence of millennia, and in doing so, cracked the delicate line between history and legend. He found the gold he longed for, yes, but also the paradox that would define all archaeology after him. Every act of discovery is also an act of loss. From that moment, the modern age inherited Troy. The spade became the symbol of truth, and the ruin, its scripture. Scientists followed where poets had once led. They measured, mapped, and dated the layers, seeking not heroes, But humans, they found fires and bones, wheat and walls. They found evidence that behind every myth lies an echo of reality, and behind every reality, a longing for myth. By the time the 21st century dawned, the city had become more than an excavation. It was an idea, reborn through technology, restored by patience, and protected by the will to remember. Troy was no longer just a battlefield of the past. It was a testament to the endurance of meaning itself. Look back through the 9 chapters, and you will see that each carries a single thread, the persistence of memory. From the poets who sang of love and loss, to the scholars who brushed away centuries of earth, to the travelers who walk the site today, all have shared the same purpose: to keep Troy alive in the human mind. Love built the legend, war gave it shape, time buried it, dreams unearthed it, and through it all, Troy endured not because of the strength of its walls, but because of the fragility of our need to remember. When we speak of Troy, we are never just speaking of an ancient city. We are speaking of ourselves. We too live between myth and fact, between what we build and what we lose. Our own cities, no matter how bright, are only temporary arrangements of stone and light. Our wars are fought for meanings we may never fully understand. Our loves, like Helen's, are both divine and destructive. Troy teaches us that the human story is not about permanence, but about pursuit, the pursuit of something worth remembering. It tells us that what endures is not power, but memory, not victory, but wonder. And so, perhaps, that is what the city has always been, not a place, but a question. How do we live, knowing that all things fall? How do we build, knowing that time will take it all away? The answer, whispered through the centuries, is simple. We build anyway. We love anyway. We remember anyway. Walk once more through the chapters. In the beginning, the poets dreamed. Then the ruins waited. Then men with shovels came and tore open the past. Then the dust settled, and scholars learned to listen instead of conquer. Then came the satellites, tracing ghosts beneath the soil. And finally came the silence again. The silence that is not absence but peace. Through every age, Troy has reflected us back to ourselves, our violence, our ambition, our longing to belong to something greater than time. If love and war both ended there, it was not because one triumphed over the other, but because both exhausted their meaning. In the stillness that followed, only memory remained. Perhaps that is what the ancients understood, though they never said it aloud, that the true immortality of a city is not in its walls, but in the stories told after it falls. Troy's stones crumble, but its name remains on every tongue that utters the word home, every heart that dreams of something worth defending, every tear shed for what can never be regained. That is Troy's legacy, not tragedy, not victory, but remembrance. And now the story closes, as the sun sets once more over the Dardanelles. The waves flash gold for a moment, then fade into blue. Somewhere far away, a new city rises. Somewhere else, an old one falls. The cycle continues. The wind moves through the grass. The earth holds its secrets. The stars burn indifferently overhead. And in that quiet, Troy breathes. The rest cannot be written. It must be felt in the hush before dawn, in the ruins that refuse to die, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For every age, every reader, every dreamer must finish Troy for themselves. Maybe that is the final lesson, that the city was never lost, never found, never ended. It only waits patiently for each of us to return. And when we do, when we walk again among the stones and dust, we will hear it whisper, "I am not gone. I am only sleeping beneath your memory."